Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Japanese Politics 101 room. Every Sunday, Timothy Langley, who runs a company in Tokyo that focuses exclusively on Japanese politics, government and public affairs, and host Pai Matsuoka, bring to you the latest developments in Japanese politics. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. The main topics today are the extraordinary diet session, the economic security angle pushed by Mr. Kishida, the Olympics in Beijing, and the Okinawa, the American base there. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Maya. So today I'd like to talk about 5 broad areas. As usual, talk about the Kishida administration, what's going on with them, what we can anticipate, and what's going on somewhat geopolitically, what's going on with some of the hot items that are coming up that you might have heard about or you might not have, but you're going to. And to be a little bit educated on what the background is would make you a smarter, conversant, and more able to engage in a political type of discussion. So that's the purpose of my 5 topics today. So first of all, let me start off with the larger group of issues, which is what's going on with the Kishida administration, what happened since last week, the last time we met. And as usual, there is always something going on from week to week. I forget what we left off with last week, but we were gearing up to a special extraordinary diet session, which started on Friday. So between the last time we had our room, which was on Sunday, and Friday, there has been some movement in anticipation of that. Ishin has kind of come up a little bit more boldly because it's got now 41 members of the parliament. So it is beginning to exercise a little bit of its throw weight, kind of testing the boundaries. And that is coming out as we move into the diet session. This will be a short diet session, 8 days. It started on Friday, not much being done, just ceremonially starting it. It will go into full session on Monday, but it'll close on Tuesday the following week, just before we start getting ready for Christmas and the end of New Year celebrations, so where the country absolutely shuts down. So within this 8-day period from Monday, keep your eyes open for what's going on in diet deliberations. They're talking about the supplementary budget and the stimulus pledge, all of the things that the government wants to do to get the economy going again, and also how much money the government intends to inject into the economy for that and for economic security reasons and all sorts of things. So you'll be hearing a lot about it. It is a huge budget that they're considering, and that is the entire focus of the 8-day session. So it will be very active in this next week in particular. There might be some fireworks the Monday following where things really come down to brass tacks, and there are a couple of fights before decisions are made, or before decisions are just put off because they're just too difficult and contentious. So we'll see. And then the diet will close on Tuesday, the 21st. And there'll be a lot to evaluate and talk about. And it will set a lot of the direction of the administration going forward until probably April. And then we will come into another phase. The diet will, of course, start again in January, probably around the 5th or the 6th, for their regularly scheduled 140-day session. And within that session, they will be preparing for the upper house election. So we're not talking too much about the upper house election right now, but once we get into the new diet session, you better believe that that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. So that's what you should be looking forward to. In addition to that, it's instructive and interesting to note that Mr. Kishida has decided to move back into the Frank Lloyd Wright official residence of the Prime Minister. And for those of you who might not know, I'm not sure, Frank Lloyd Wright designed and built the Prime Minister's official residence. It's a brick building. It's in the Diet compound where the Prime Minister's office is, the big new maybe 5-story underground and 3 or 4-story above ground building. It's a big, beautiful building. That's where the Prime Minister's office is. And there is a beautiful mansion that was built by Frank Lloyd Wright in, 1929, I guess. And so he was here building, not just that, he was also building other structures here in Japan, not just Japan. And he was also engaged to build the Prime Minister's residence. And very few people, I guess, have have seen it or been inside it. But it is it's very Art Deco. It's got a lot of design features. When you look at it, you go, wow, who designed this? Because this is really kind of un-Japanese. But it was built and launched in 1929 to kind of begin to show the Japanese and the world that Japan had joined the international community and was a little bit hipper than what people thought, and was beginning to emerge. 3 years later, 4 years later, they completed the Diet Complex, the huge, massive Diet building that is right in the middle of Tokyo. That construction lasted 12 years. So there was a lot going on at that period of time. And this building, it's a historical building. There was, an assassination of a prime minister there in the tie-up, in the lead-up to, the Pacific War and the militarization of Japan in 1932. A prime minister was assassinated there. And so it has this history, and it has this aura to it. And I think people who are in the room and have been living in Japan know this for just because of a lot of historical and interesting innuendo. If there is ever a death or a suicide in an apartment building or a house, it needs to be disclosed to somebody who wants to rent that, and of course the price just tumbles down. So that the effect of having somebody having been killed, in fact, in a building is a big deal. So they exercised that building several times. They've refurbished it, and now the prime minister is moving into it. It's the first time in maybe 10, 15 years that a prime minister has lived in the official residence. I've been there several times when I worked in the parliament, and it is connected. It used to be the building that now this massive building represents, the 5 stories underground and the 3 stories above ground. That used to be the official residence. And they actually picked it up and put it on rollers and moved it, maybe 30 meters to the side, so it wasn't in the way of the new construction. But it's got a beautiful garden in the back. They used to have lots of tea parties and signing ceremonies there. So I think what we can look forward to with the prime minister moving there, a little bit more robust engagement with the population as a consequence of that. It's a subliminal, but I think it's a very big deal that the prime minister is moving there. And so I think you'll see a lot more activity coming out of the prime minister's office, and a lot more entertaining of social guests and diplomatic visitors there. It'll be a pretty big deal, I predict. Moving on from there, and we can talk about that later if you want to. The floor is always open. If you want to tag Maya to come up, we can flag that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about China's Olympics that are coming up very soon. Within the next 90 days, they will start their Olympics. The United States has publicly said, we're not going to send any diplomatic representation and thumb their nose at China, but they're going to send the athletes. And then they're saying, hey, everybody else, what do you think? And they did get some takers. Australia jumped in, Britain jumped in, Canada jumped in. And in true form, the Japanese are kind of looking at their palms and wondering, what that line means, and trying to deflect attention to them as they consider what their response is going to be. They're actually going to sit on it a little bit. They're going to wait and see who else jumps on the bandwagon. But publicly, they're trying to be supportive. Yes, we will go along with the United States there. So they have essentially said that they're not going to send any cabinet ministers, which is kind of the same thing. But they are going to be sending representatives. It's the Japanese are in a far more delicate, a far more maybe vulnerable position than the United States with regard to their reactions to China. So I think that their approach will be modeled on the American approach, because the American relationship is very critical to the Japanese as well. But they don't want to unnecessarily peeve off the Chinese with their approach. So they will be sending representatives, but they probably won't be cabinet ministers, and certainly not the prime minister. It's interesting to note in this regard with China and Taiwan and the Olympics, projecting what is going to happen there. Is there going to be a hot war? Is there going to be a cold war? What is the strategy of the Chinese, and what is the strategy of the United States and the Japanese in preventing this kind of thing from tumbling out of control? And if you think about it, you would if you were the Chinese government, you would want to isolate Taiwan and then convince everybody who was either sitting on the fence or in support of a separate Taiwan, encourage them to change their mind somehow and be more favorable to a one China policy that allows China to integrate Taiwan as a rebel region at some point in the future. And I think the Chinese have been very successful at that. And it's important to note that just this last week, Nicaragua also just broke ties with Taiwan and acknowledged China as the definer of what is going on in China, including Taiwan as a portion of Taiwan. This has been going on for a long time. In fact, Taiwan only has 14 formal diplomatic ties. That's pretty interesting. Of the 193 nations, Taiwan only has 14 formal diplomatic ties. It's not just Nicaragua that broke with them. Also, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Panama. Panama, the Panama Canal. That's a pretty big deal. The Solomon Islands, Kiribati, all of these countries have gone full hog on China, in somewhat in conjunction with the Belt and Road strategy of building roads and bridges and port facilities in exchange for getting a little bit of a diplomatic nod in the right direction. So this, you can see this thing continuing to go forward. It is subliminally aggressive, depending on how you view it, and it is a kind of an encroachment policy. But it doesn't. It's not hot. It doesn't involve people being killed, but it does, disturb the balance of international, what the international order is. You can expect that this sort of thing that is not really militarily aggressive, but maybe somewhat fearful for the people who want to keep to allow Taiwan to keep their options open, is beginning to diminish and will continue to be so. So we can continue to see that going on. What the Chinese like to do, which makes it easy for them, is to find those countries that have a little bit of a difficulty with the United States and their relationship. So Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua, has had a long-standing battle with the United States, and the negotiations on trade and policy there, it finally came to a breaking point. It's interesting now to just keep that in context as we talk about other things that are going on in the region. This is not to be too suggestive, but Okinawa is one of 47 prefectures of the Japanese nation, the Japanese archipelago. Of the 47, it is the poorest of all prefectures for a lot of different reasons. Many of them, I believe, are artificial, and it also has the longest longevity of any prefecture. The people live longer there. They have more children in Okinawa. And so there are a lot of unique things about Okinawa. And as everybody in this room, I think, knows, I basically grew up in Okinawa. I left Okinawa when I was 16 years old, and went back to the United States and couldn't wait to come back. So I did come back eventually. But Okinawa always holds a special place in my heart. So I know a lot about it, and I follow it, and I keep up to date with it. It was its own nation before it was subjugated in the 1600s by a Japanese clan, before the Japanese island really became a full nation. But it's been a place that's been subjugated throughout its history, recent history. And Richard Nixon, after the war, the United States took over Okinawa as a protectorate and held it until 1971, when Richard Nixon reverted it back to Japan. And ever since then, the Okinawans and the central government of Japan have been in this tug of war. You're not really Japanese. We are Japanese. We're going to help the prefectures where we have great interest. And in Okinawa, we have great interest, but the United States has certain claims to bases and military support and that sort of thing. And the reason why this is important now is because the United States and Japan are going through this constant argument about how much we're going to pay to keep American troops here. And the reason why Okinawa is important is because Okinawa supports the major portion of what the U.S. military presence is in Japan throughout the entire nation. Most of the soldiers, most of the facilities, most of the energy is in Okinawa. It is spread out in other places like other places in Sasebo, Kiwakuni, their airport bases, their naval bases elsewhere. But Okinawa has by far, the largest naval, military, and Marine Corps presence. And they were initially on a 5-year plan of how much the United States expects the Japanese to pay for this support. It's a part of the status of forces agreement, so that Japan, not able to have offensive capabilities, relies on the United States to provide that protection for them, and the Japanese would double down on the defensive capabilities. And that has been the basic arrangement. And when they talk about how much the United States expects the Japanese to pay for this protection, it's always on a 5-year rolling term. And you might remember when President Trump was in office, he threatened the Japanese by saying, look, you're not paying your fair share. The Germans aren't either. Nobody is. Everybody's cheating. And so we want you to pay your fair share. And he came up with a plan where the Japanese would pay about 4 times what they're paying currently. That didn't get off the ground very far. It caused a lot of consternation here in Tokyo, not so much in Okinawa. And the reason for that is because how Okinawa is being facilitated and treated is all dependent on what's going on here in Tokyo. And that is really the big rub. And so the reason why it's a topic of conversation today is because of COVID, the 5-year plan didn't quite work out, and it's been stalled. So we're in 2021, 2022, we're in a kind of a gap where they've decided how much money they're going to spend, but it's just for 1 year, and let's get back together and get on the 5-year plan this year. And what came up as a consequence of that was the Japanese government decided to redesign the bases in Henoko. So if you're familiar with the story there, in Futenma is the largest military marine base, and it sits right in the middle of the island, and the whole civilian population has grown up around this area. And from time to time, since there's so much activity there are planes taking off, helicopters, a lot of training, things happen, things fall off of planes, things are broken, and they fall into the neighborhoods, and it causes such a great concern. So they've decided, in order to reduce the amount of tension among the Japanese, the Okinawan population against the military, that they were going to move to a new place. It's not really perfect for what they wanted. It's not as large, but they're going to design it so that it can take most of the brunt of what's going on in Futenma. In conjunction with that, they're going to move many of the forces to Guam. So try and reduce the footprint on Okinawa overall. Of course, Japan would pay for the relocation from Futenma to Guam, and it would also pay for the design and construction of this new place in Henoko. So now the central government has come up with a redesign plan, and the current governor, a fellow by the name of Tamaki Denny, he is not pure Japanese. He's half. I think his father was in the military in Okinawa, but he's a real firecracker. He was in the parliament for about 9 years, as in the lower house, and then he ran for governor. So he's very well known and liked in Okinawa, and they're in a huge fight with this dictate to redesign Henoko, and the Japanese will pay for part of that, and Okinawa will be hosting it. And the fight now is that Okinawa is receiving not so much love from the central government, and you should be, doing more. You should have economic development here. You should have more resources here. And there's always this tug of war because of the United States presence and how that wants to be controlled and dictated by the central government. And Okinawa, as the host, is saying, hey, wait a minute, guys, you should at least involve us in the conversation. There's that tension there, if you can kind of put the pieces together from what I've just explained to you. So this fight is ongoing. It's continuing. It just was revealed this last week that the Japanese government, doing its investigation of the geological strata there, discovered when they first did this 15 years ago of some deficiencies in the construction, but they didn't say anything about it. And the Americans came in and decided this was a piece of land for them. And now they're beginning to understand that these deficiencies existed and were known to the central government. So there's that kind of passive resistance that goes on at the central government level, but also similarly between Okinawa and the central government. It's a fight that's not going to end. The Japanese government has said, look, like our new design, we will withdraw spending more money in Okinawa and having more of a facilitation there. It's just a really huge issue. It continues. Once again, Okinawa ends up getting their teeth kicked in. and it's a fight that will continue into the future. It's something you should keep your eye on because it's representative of the status of forces agreement between Japan and the United States, and also the role of Okinawa in this provision of offensive capabilities. So this becomes important because now in the Diet they are considering strike capabilities. They're considering that right now. That will be something that will be in a policy outline that is a platform for the 2022 upper house elections. So the theory of defense capabilities as opposed to defensive and offensive capabilities is an argument that's going on right now. Mr. Abe has long pushed for the revision of the Constitution to accommodate that. So it's a part of that. Mr. Amari, Mr. Kishida have been talking about that. Ishin has also said if there's a revision to the Constitution, we would support that. So this is something, and Okinawa is one major component of that whole argument. So you will be seeing that more often as we approach the upper house elections. And I think probably in the summer, there will be a push for a referendum vote and a revision of the Constitution. It could happen this year for sure. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the snafu that the administration has had about closing the borders, opening the borders. We've got this new variant. It's really dangerous. Everybody's going to die. Omicron is out of Africa, and we need to have high border walls so the Mexicans can't crawl over. That sort of thing happened within the last 2 weeks. It was revised very quickly after it came out that the bureaucracy acted a little bit hastily and didn't quite involve the central government or Mr. Kishida. He didn't know about the closing of it wasn't quite closing of the borders. It was the closing of the airports and the issuing of tickets for people coming into Japan. That took about 3 days to become known, and then another 3 days to get cleared up. He backtracked on that. He told the airlines to go ahead and issue travel tickets and authorizations, not so much visas, but a little bit on visas. They kept the number of people coming in daily into Japan throughout the nation from 5,000 people per day to 3,000 people per day, and then they pushed it back up to 5,000. And that's just 5,000 a day throughout the entire country. That's not through one airport, which is almost astounding when you think about it. So this consensus right now is we're going to look at what Omicron is doing in terms of vulnerabilities, but we're going to let Japanese nationals come back in. It's Oshogatsu. We're preparing for the end of the year. Their families, spouses, people who are related to them, spouses who might not be Japanese nationals, can come in. Business people are still getting a bit of a hard time there. Students and researchers are still getting a little bit of a hard time. There's been some developments, and we can expect other developments to come out this next week because the impact of Omicron is becoming a little bit more apparent. It turns out that the Japanese seem to have a bit of an advantage genetically in dealing with this particular variant. So a lot is just being rolled out as the days go on. But I think we can look at fuller flexibility moving into the new year. So the Go-To campaign is predicted to get back in gear probably in February. Currently, that's what they're thinking about. I know, Maya, this is an area that's in your area of professional specialization, so you might have a little bit better insight on that. But that's the contentious issue that was confronted by the Kishida administration over the last 10 days. It looks like it's beginning to settle down, but he's in a delicate spot because people are wondering, is this administration a good administration to go to? We talked about him moving into the official residence of the prime minister. It used to have a bit of a what would you call a ghost to it, that if you moved into the prime minister's residence, that meant that your tenure as prime minister was going to be very, very short. So there was a period of time when Japan went through about 10 prime ministers in a period of 12 years, and each of them wanted to move into the prime minister's residence, and they didn't last very long. So there's that aura, there's that history there that Mr. Abe moved into the prime minister's residence. He lasted a year, and then he resigned. And when he became prime minister again, he didn't go into the prime minister's residence. It's been vacant since then. So there's that kind of thing. That's why I threw it in earlier. It's an interesting part of history and culture, but it is also somewhat representative of the dynamics of what people consider going into Japanese politics. I'd like to close my comments now, and Maya, Can you weigh in on the border restrictions that we've been talking about?
Oh, yes. Well, the news now, which is coming from the government, is that they're going to start the Go To campaign, actually restarted on February the 1st. Hopefully, this will be the case indeed, but we don't know. Of course, it depends on the situation with Omicron, and if, any new variants suddenly come into being, then it will be really difficult probably for the government to start the campaign. And they say that, of course, it also depends on the public acceptance. Timothy, I have a few questions to you. My first question is, we have heard that you told us that the extraordinary diet session started, but there has been some movement also with the factions in the LDP. So, and
Great. That's right. You're great to point that out.
And I'm going to ask you if you could tell us a little bit more about the factions, because obviously they also have, let's say, influence on how the diet session goes. We know that the LDP has a majority in the lower house, so obviously what they do and what happens in the party also influences the policy of and the strategy of the party too. Sorry.
Okay. Can I respond to that before you go into
Yes,
sub
please do,
B
yes.
and sub C?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll have
So
up to D. Sorry, please go ahead.
So the party, the faction politics is always very rich. I should have gone a little bit into more detail there because there is movement. There's always movement going on there. There is never a time when we're going to open this clubhouse room and you're going to hear me say, well, there's not very much to talk about this week. Even in a slow week, there's a lot going on. So, for example, Ishin is now beginning to become a little bit more maybe aggressive. Aggressive is not quite the right word, but they're beginning to flex their muscles. They selected their party head to talk on behalf of the Ishin. They've questioned the prime minister. They've made political statements about what their stance is, and they've kind of drawn the line in the sand on several issues in order to flag to the electorate what they stand for and why they're different and why they're a better alternative. So one of the things that they did was they snubbed the nose of everybody else in the diet by saying, we are opposed to this policy of diet members getting 1 million yen every month for, finger quote, communication and transportation logistics fees. And what this is, not many people knew about it until they complained about it and brought it to the forefront of discussion, was that every diet member gets 1 million yen each month for what is loosely termed communication transportation fees, which is not required to be represented by receipts. And that's something on top of everything else. So that's like free money. You don't pay any taxes on that. It is money that is to be spent for at your discretion, essentially. And I wonder how the diet was able to pass something as difficult as that. That's 720 some odd members of the parliament, including the lower house and the upper house, getting 1 million yen each month. I wonder how they passed that through the diet. You've got to laugh at that. It's been going on for a long time, and this being raised as an issue. So what happens is the members of the parliament get this, and they belong to a faction, and the faction says, you're getting 1 million yen each month, and we know you're not using it and traveling and that communication, so why don't you donate it to us, your political faction? And so that's what happens. 90% of those fees, because people are watching. Your bosses are watching. You've gotten that check coming in. So they use that as a political donation. So those factions and those political parties who have more members, you can see that just incrementally encouraging them to donate the money that they don't use is a huge boost. The other thing that's very, interesting or funny or makes you scratch your head is, you remember last week when we were talking about Ishihara Nobuteru, we talked about him two weekends in a row because initially his political faction, he lost his election, you'll remember, in the lower house election just recently, and he's the leader of a political faction, the Ishihara faction, and he's been pretty prominent in Japanese politics. He's had several ministerial portfolios, but he didn't win his election, and as a consequence of that, probably his faction will disintegrate as a result of that. That was the view that we held last week. I can say with a little bit more conviction that that's going to happen, certainly. And the reason is because within the last couple of days, if we held this room only once a month, we might even forget to mention this. But within the last couple of days, you will remember that Mr. Kishida appointed him as a special advisor to the cabinet. We scratched our heads about that last week when it first came out. Why would he invite Mr. Ishihara into his cabinet as an advisor? He lost his diet seat. He's not a member of the diet anymore. He's got this faction that will probably disintegrate without him as a leader holding a seat in the diet. Oh my gosh, look at that. Mr. Kishida gave him a advisor position within the cabinet. Isn't that interesting? Why would he do that? And then the news on Thursday that Mr. Ishihara, so that companies and industry get a COVID payment. Actually, people who are working in the companies, because they're working from home or they're not fully engaged, the companies are receiving supplements from the government that is supposed to go to the employees. And what happened with Mr. Ishihara's organization is that he was receiving that money but not paying it to the employees, and that became public on Thursday. Mr. Ishihara received a phone call from the Prime Minister and resigned from his special administrative advisory position immediately. So that is not yet in the news. It should be, in the news by now. I haven't seen it covered, but Bunshun is going to just go over it. Bunshun is published on Thursdays. This news came out on Thursday, so there was nothing there on that. So we will be hearing something about it in the coming days. But that's a little bit of the background, and it just, you have to scratch your head and wonder why somebody of such wealth and power and influence needs to take the supplemental income received by the government to pay to employees who are working from home or just to maintain their salary basis and squirreling that away and filling their own pockets with it. It is really despicable. It happens a lot, and I think having a kind of a showcase example of what can happen to you if you get caught is probably useful to the public prosecutors and the tax office, but it is happening a lot. He just got caught, and I think you'll see much more of this happening in the near term. Anyway, that's a long-winded response to your question about what's going on factionally in the factional politics of the LDP. I hope it responds somewhat.
Yes, it does. Thank you. My next question, I have a couple actually, and some of them came via the back channel. So
I think there's a limit though. You only get one or two, Maya.
Okay, my second one then. So here we
I'm
go.
kidding.
Of course. Okay. Anyway, thank you for kidding, but however. So the next question is, you mentioned that this extraordinary session of the Diet will be dedicated mostly to voting the supplementary budget. And so we know that, it's going to be, 2 weeks long? And they're going to talk about it and decide how much money will go into the economy and, let's say other let's say field of social life, if I can say so. But my question is, we have never ever heard anything about fiscal policy, from Mr. Kishida. So they always talk about the budget, supplementary budget, and so on. But we really, or maybe I have missed it, but we haven't heard anything about something specific, how they intend to go forward from, let's say, next year. So if you have heard anything about it, I would love to hear. Yeah.
Great question, and that once again reminds me of something else I kind of forgot to mention to the group. With regard to the fiscal budget, yes, you're going to hear a lot about that in these next coming days. When the Diet holds an extraordinary session like this, it will be an 8-day session. It was Friday, and then all next week, which are 5 days, and then the next Monday, and then it'll close on Tuesday. So that's 8 days. The Diet gets together, or basically the steering committee gets together, and they decide the agenda and the timeline. And that's basically decided by the LDP with its how much power it has. So they kind of define the timing and the agenda for distributing different segments to different issues. So that's what's starting on Monday, and they will be talking about fiscal policy. One of the other things that came out just on Friday, I think, you'll remember that Komeito really insisted once the election was over, in fact, they used it as an election campaign platform, was that everybody who has children should get 100,000 yen as a kind of help because they have to educate their children, and they're probably of all people suffering a lot, and they could use the money. And after the election, the LDP acquiesced and said, "Okay, we will agree to that, but we want to split it up because that's a lot of money, and it's going to hurt our fiscal revenue quite a bit. So we're going to promote Gomayen, 50,000 yen, and cash, and that goes out immediately to everybody who has children under the age of 16 who have a income of a certain amount." They went through a week of discussion about that. They eventually came up with a means test. So not everybody who has children under 16 gets it, but they settled it so that 90% of the people in Japan who have children under 16 get the Jumayen, the 100,000. They also decided that it would be a 550,000 yen in cash, and then the rest of it in coupons to be issued around March or April. And then you can use these coupons. So the big fight this last week, that was the situation when we closed the room last week. This fight this week was on who wants to spend coupons. What the hell is it with these coupons? Why don't if you're going to give people the money, give them the goddamn money. And Ishin was very strong on this. And of course, Komeito is clapping their hands and jumping up and down. And so now Ishin and Komeito they're finding common ground here. And it turns out that they won that battle. So the issue of issuing coupons has disappeared. We're not going to issue coupons anymore. Everybody said, what a stupid idea, how much money it takes to issue coupons, to produce them, to prevent them from being counterfeit, to deciding what you can buy with the coupon and what you can't buy with the coupon. It's a bunch of bull. Let's just get down to it. Let's give people Jumayen, give it to them right away. That fight was this last week. So I think that it shows you a little bit, Maya, about how these kinds of things are decided and how they're fought upon. This issue is 2 months old, and finally we've come to a conclusion now. It's really argument around the edges. The initial policy was, I think, something that people could subscribe to, but getting down to the details took, almost 2 months. And I think that happens pretty frequently, and we can anticipate that going forward in these next 8 days. So in these next eight days, what's going on with fiscal policy? Who is getting what kind of money? Where are we putting it in terms of, reducing the carbon footprint in Japan? How we're going to get foreign capital companies to come to Japan to build infrastructure here for making chips or for sustainable energy, for educating the children in a better and a more responsive way. There's a lot of those issues that will be under discussion. I hope that responds somewhat to your first of several questions, Maya.
Yes, it does. Well, it looks like everything is decided on the go, and it's really difficult to see how. I mean, just the concerted action by the government when it comes to fiscal policies. And for some reason, when we read this and that in the media, we can, let's say, get an image of what they're trying to do, but at the same time, it's not really out there, black and white. So
it's hard to see because the LDP has such a stranglehold on how things are going to be decided. And it's somewhat similar to what's going on in the United States, where the Democrats hold a lot of power, but it's not a magnificent hold on power. So the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting, and they're criticizing all the time because that distinction between a Democrat and a Republican, it's very close. But here in Japan, the LDP has such a sway on power. So a lot of times the opposition parties are just acquiescing and looking for an opportunity to throw in their opinion. They are given that opportunity to criticize and to promote their own views, but they all understand that even if we claim that, the decision is going to go the way that the party in power wants it to. So how can we enter that discussion and not look like we got our teeth kicked in because our proposal was defeated? How can we come out of that argument and still look good? That's a real challenge for the opposition.
Indeed. Well, let me go on with the questions which I got via the back channel. So the first one is from Hiroko, and it is: Japan is considering to send Seiko Hashimoto or Yamashita of
Right.
JOC. Is it considered to be a diplomatic boycott, or it's different? If different, how?
Okay, so that's a great question, and thank you for the question, because other people are asking that question now too. So as it stands right now, the government is kind of hemming and hawing about who they're going to send. And yes, is it going to be Yasuhiro Yamashita, or is it going to be somebody from the Tokyo Organizing Committee, or is it going to be somebody from the agency. So there are several cabinet portfolios, and then under the cabinet portfolios, there are a couple of agencies, and the agencies are not represented in the cabinet. So you could say that, and the Japanese have said, we're not going to send anybody from the cabinet, but somebody from an agency who is not sitting in the cabinet could be acceptable, I guess. Also, from the Tokyo Organizing Committee, that's not really, yeah, it's not somebody, it's somebody from the government, obviously. And I think the president of the organizing committee has the prime minister has a role in identifying and selecting who that person is, just like with NHK, which is, you know, the public broadcasting. But the Tokyo Olympic Organizing Committee, the Japan Organizing Committee, I think would be a little. So the person she identified, Mr. Yamashita, is the president of the Japan Olympic Committee, and that's pretty close. But it's not a cabinet portfolio. It's about as close as you can get without being that. So I think the Japanese, they haven't made a decision yet. They're looking around and seeing how other people do that. I think to satisfy the United States, they will say, you know, the prime minister is not going to go and no cabinet officials are going to go. But there are a whole lot of other people who could potentially go. And by the way, when the teams go to these kinds of events, they do need extra support. They do need people who weld positions of power, because things happen, you know. During the Olympics, you know, people, you know, they get into trouble. You know, they get caught drinking when they're not supposed to be drinking. They get caught sneaking into the women's dormitory. There's thousands of things that happen, and you do need people in positions of power on site so that they can resolve these issues, you know, quietly and quickly. So they do play a role, but diplomatically, I think the Japanese will probably stick to their guns and not send somebody within the current cabinet. I hope that's responsive.
I hope so too. And then there is a follow-up to this question. Is the Japanese anthem and the flag posted at the Olympics, I guess? So
Sure,
yes.
sure, yeah.
Okay.
So just because just because the hosting, I'm sorry, the contributing or the joining country is not sending their prime minister or members, doesn't affect one way or the other when they win or they place, that their national flag is not being raised, and when they win first place, that their national anthem is played or not. I don't think there's a decision. There's a distinction there. It's obviously they would. I mean, what a slap in the face that would be if, in fact, the Chinese decided to do that. You would find a lot of people fleeing the games.
And then another question, which is on a different point, is from Takeshi. So I'm going to read the comment first. I had an opportunity to join a lecture session by Yoshiki Hidaka, former NHK Washington chief correspondent back in the 80s, and the legendary journalist yesterday, saying, President Trump will be re-elected in 2024. No way for China to attack Taiwan, considering the gap in capabilities of Navy or submarine forces. So, Timothy, what do you think about this?
No, I am not. I'm not going to touch that. I appreciate the bait that has been laid, but yeah, that's you know, what's going on with former President Trump, what's going on with the administration, the Biden administration, his performance and his health, and the position of the vice president, and just the unbelievable stuff that's going on in politics right now. It's really difficult to predict, and I'm more familiar with what's going on in Japanese politics. I follow U.S. politics because it's interesting and it's dynamic, and it is important because I continue to hold a U.S. passport. But it's not something that I would opine on. There are many people that are following it much more closely and know more of the scuttlebutt and what's going on with you know, the underground, and with you know, the forces to drain the swamp and to put Mr. Trump back in power. It's really too big, too huge. There are too many variables to really, for somebody of my position, to comment one way or the other on that. But I appreciate the debate.
Okay. Yes, because it seems that there are no strong candidates at this point of time. So, well, with the exception of Trump, of course. And yes. Well,
yeah, I mean, on the Republican side, there are some really good, strong candidates. On the Democrat side, you know, their go-to person, if something should happen with the prime minister, is Kamala Harris as vice president, and her standing within the you know, the public, and her press reports, and and things that are being said and the performance that she's been able to generate are not very encouraging. So there needs to be on the Democratic side, a filler. Who else could possibly be there to excite the population, to give them confidence? Even though the president says he's going to run in 2024, you look at his performance now and you're thinking, are you going to be around? And if you're not going to be around, if there's going to be a smooth transition, then it needs to go to the current vice president. That's what the Constitution dictates. But there could be some switches. There could be some, anything can happen there.
Right. Yes, I invite also, I think that it may be good to hear some other people in the audience if they have an opinion about this. But of course, if you have questions about the Japanese politics, please join us here. Let me know and I'll bring you up. So in the meantime, Timothy, please, I hope that you don't mind me asking another question to you.
Oh, God. Okay.
Yeah.
But listen, just to step a little bit on what you had earlier said, this room is about Japanese politics. If we get into what's going on in the U.S., I mean, there are other rooms that are doing that. I think we can excel in talking about those things that we're seeped in and what our audience is good in. I don't want to get too much into the U.S. side. That's just a can of worms that I think even for the specialists there, it's a very difficult, very contentious issue.
We talked about the lack of fiscal policy, at least, holistic fiscal policy, if I can put it in this way. And we know that Mr. Kishida, he has set up two new committees in
yes,
right. So one of them is the LDP transformation, that is the party transformation, and also the other one is about the new capitalism. So I just wonder if there are any pieces of news about these committees and what they have been tasked with. I mean, of course, the titles are probably self-explanatory to a certain extent, but still.
Right. So one of the things that we can look forward to in so he did have a policy statement just before they opened the extraordinary session, where he talked a little bit about his vision, and it's true that his vision is not in line with the four arrows of the Abe administration. It's distinctly different from that. And the problem is that if he becomes too different from what the Abe strategy was, he's going to run up against ingrained policies that are already there. He's going to have to upset things. Mm-hmm. So he's backed off a little bit, but philosophically, what he wants to do, and he's already made pronouncements and indications that this is what will be part of his policy. But spiritually, what he wants to do is make the Japanese economy more responsive to more people. So the rich don't get richer, and then the poor get more numerous. He wants to elevate the number and the standard of living of people that are in the middle class. So he wants to bring people out of poverty. He wants to reduce the number of homeless. He wants to increase social services to particularly children and to orphans and to single parent families. He's big on that. And conversely, on the upper end, he wants to make sure that the people who are getting windfalls of profit and income are reduced a little bit. So that, and in particular, he's talking about companies. So the companies are the biggest violators, because what they do is they generate profits and then they hoard those profits. They storehouse that for a rainy day, and that's been going on for 10 years during the Abe administration. This trickle-down theory of let the corporations make a lot of money, let people get more and more wealthy, and they will purchase things. They will invigorate the economy. And I think for people who live in Tokyo, one of the things you notice is the just incredible number of Maserati that you see on the streets these days, and really nice, expensive cars, relatively new, over the last 4 or 5 years. When new models come out, I mean, it's just flashy. You see them driving through Tokyo. So there are people who are increasing their wealth basis. Mr. Kishida, he wants that to be a little bit slower. He wants it to be not as ostentatious, and to increase salaries of people who are working. So there's a bit of a fight between him and Keidanren. Keidanren is the largest lobbying organization in Japan. It's the Association of Japanese Businesses, and they are opposed to wage increases. They're getting prepared for the Shunto, the annual labor offensive that is in the spring. They're insisting on a 4% wage increase from last year for member companies and for generally the population at large. That doesn't sound like very much to me. I mean, if you're going to go for it, and in the context of the Kishida administration, I would think you'd go a little bit harder. But that is the profile of the labor organizations in moving forward, and I think they'll probably get that. So with regard to the administration overall, I think you're going to see, a movement on capital gains tax and also on attractiveness to make Japan and probably Tokyo in particular a more attractive place to invest for foreign capital companies. So you're going to see a movement there on the inheritance tax. There's been really strict regulations with regard to inheritance. So they treat most foreign capital company executives, when they come to Japan, they make a big salary, they're working for a company, they treat them like a Japanese national in terms of inheritance tax. So if you come to Japan, you've been here for 4 or 5 years, you make a lot of money, and the company rotates you out, and now you're in Dubai and you die, the Japanese income tax has the ability to reach over to Dubai, even though you've been out of Japan for 3 or 4 years, and attach a certain amount of your assets. So that is preventing people from, being long-term residents of Japan, and it hurts the entire economy. So you're going to see a lot of things like that from the Kishida administration. But what he wants is, and we see this now with the appointment of Kobayashi Takayuki as the minister in charge of economic security. He is a protege of Mr. Amari. Mr. Kishida and Mr. Amari are the heads of the strategic headquarters of the new International Order, which is one of the organizations that you were talking about. So there's a big push there for revitalizing the Japanese economy into a new capitalism. That's what he calls it. Nobody knows what that actually means. He initially wanted to make sure that people got more money and then would figure out how to generate that internally. That was slapped down. We're going to generate it internally first, and then we're going to distribute it. So that's a policy issue. How to generate that money, how to get more tax income from people who should be paying more taxes, how are we going to distribute that to the people, how are we going to figure out who gets it and who doesn't. Those are initiatives that will be rolled out this year and probably be implemented in fiscal next year or the year after that. So these are really big fiscal issues that require a lot of discussion. They're different from what the Abe administration was. His 4 arrows went on for 10 years. So it does take a bit of redoing. And also, it's not like Mr. Kishida is building on what was going on before him like Mr. Suga was. He wants to change things. So that always involves much more time and effort. And I think this idea of moving into the prime minister's residence is also significant in that he intends to be there for a long time. His predecessor, not Suga, Mr. Abe, was there for the longest serving prime minister. It needs to be repeated so that when I go to international conferences, people remember my name as Mr. Kishida, not Mr. Kishi, or they mispronounce it or whatever. It takes time for even people to figure out what Mr. Abe's name was. Abe? Is it Abe? Oh, it's Abe, right? So that takes time too. So he's got a big game plan, and it's just going to take several years for it to roll out. I hope that's somewhat responsive, and I apologize for it being so long, Maya.
Yes, you have a good teacher, so. Right. Yeah, thank you for the answer, indeed.
Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you always for sponsoring and for moderating this room. It's a great room. I look forward to it every week. And our audience just continues to grow. People are interested in knowing what's going on in Japanese politics. They're not interested in the dirty details and the blood and guts that lays on the floor, but they want to know what's going on. Why is it important? Why should I pay any attention to it? And just, keep me educated on what's going on in Japanese politics. So I so very much appreciate people tuning in. I appreciate you hosting this room, Maya. I think it's a great service to the community. And I'm excited when people come up to the room or when I get 15 questions from you.
Thank you very much again. Have a great day, and we're looking forward to having you again next week. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks, everybody.
This was Japan Expert Insights Room on Japanese politics. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next Sunday at 8:30 in the morning, Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and enjoy every day as much as possible. See you!